The morning sun painted the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink as Maria stepped out of the small apartment above the ranch garage. She had been living here for 3 years now, and every sunrise still felt like a gift. The Thompson family ranch stretched out before her, 2,000 acres of rolling hills, green pastures, an endless sky that made her feel safe in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Maria pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and walked toward the main house. At 28, she had learned to appreciate the quiet moments. The way the grass crunched under her boots, the sound of cattle calling to each other in the distance, the peaceful silence that meant no one was yelling, no doors were slamming, and no one was telling her she was worthless. She had been working as a housekeeper for Frank and Betty Thompson since she first arrived in Montana. The job posting had been simple. Housekeeper needed for ranch family, room and board provided, references required. What it didn't say was that the Thompsons would become the family she never knew she needed. Frank Thompson was 55 years old, with hands that told stories of decades spent working the land. His face was weathered from years under the sun, but his eyes were kind. He spoke slowly and thoughtfully, never raised his voice, and treated everyone with respect, something Maria had never experienced from a man before. Betty Thompson was a small woman with silver hair and a smile that could warm the coldest winter day. She had taught Maria how to make proper cornbread, how to tend the vegetable garden, and most importantly, how to trust again. Betty never asked too many questions about Maria's past, but she noticed the small things, the way Maria jumped when doors closed too loudly, how she always sat facing the door in any room, the faint white scars on her wrists that she covered with long sleeves even in summer. The Thompsons had an old border collie named Scout, who had become Maria's constant companion. The dog seemed to understand that Maria needed extra protection, always staying close to her side and positioning himself between her and strangers. Scout was getting old now, his black and white fur turning gray around his muzzle, but he still followed Maria everywhere she went. Maria's real name wasn't Maria. 3 years ago, she had been someone else entirely, living in a small town in Arizona where the sun was too hot and the nights were filled with fear. She had been married to a man who believed that marriage gave him ownership over another human being, a man who used his fists to win arguments and his voice to tear down her spirit piece by piece. The decision to leave hadn't been easy. It had taken her 2 years to save enough money, hiding $20 here and $50 there in places he would never think to look. She had researched how to disappear, how to change her identity, how to start over in a place where no one would know her story. Montana had called to her because of its vastness. In a state with more cows than people, it was easy to disappear. She had driven her old Honda until it finally died just outside the town of Clearwater. The mechanic who towed her car had mentioned that the Thompson family was looking for help, and within a week she had a new life. The Thompsons never made her feel like hired help. Betty included her in family dinners and holiday celebrations. Frank taught her how to drive the ranch truck and showed her which tools to use for basic repairs around the property. They celebrated her birthday even though she had never told them when it was. Betty had simply picked a day in spring and declared it Maria's special day. For 3 years, Maria had lived without looking over her shoulder. She had grown her hair long again because no one was there to grab it during arguments. She wore dresses because no one criticized her appearance or called her names. She laughed out loud because no one told her she was too noisy. She had learned what peace felt like. The ranch had become her sanctuary. She knew every corner of the property, every trail through the woods, every spot where wildflowers bloomed in spring. She knew which horses were gentle enough for beginners and which ones needed experienced riders. She knew where Scout liked to nap in the afternoons and which corner of the barn cats preferred for raising their kittens. Maria had even started dreaming about the future again. Maybe someday she would have her own small house on the property. Maybe she would learn how to raise chickens or tend beehives like Betty had always wanted to try. Maybe she would even find someone to love who would never raise a hand to her in anger. The only shadow that occasionally crossed her mind was the knowledge that her husband back in Arizona had never filed for divorce. She had checked online records. Whenever she went to the library in town, and legally, she was still married. But Arizona felt like another lifetime. and she had convinced herself that he had moved on with his life, just as she had moved on with hers. On this particular October morning, Maria was hanging laundry on the line behind the main house. The sheets snapped in the wind like white flags of surrender, and she found herself humming while she worked. Betty was inside preparing lunch, and Frank was somewhere out in the south pasture checking on the pregnant cows. Scout was lying in his favorite spot under the old oak tree, his ears twitching at sounds only he could hear. The dog suddenly lifted his head and stared down the long dirt road that connected the ranch to the main highway. His body tensed in a way that made Maria pause with a wet pillowcase in her hands. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. Scout stood up slowly, his tail rigid and his eyes focused on something in the distance. Maria squinted and saw a small cloud of dust rising from the road. Someone was driving up to the ranch, and they were driving fast. Visitors weren't unusual. The Thompsons had neighbors who stopped by to borrow tools or share news. The veterinarian came monthly to check on the animals. Delivery trucks brought supplies for the ranch. But something about the way Scout was acting made Maria's stomach tighten with a feeling she recognized, but had hoped never to experience again. Fear. The dust cloud grew larger, and Maria could make out the shape of a dark vehicle moving up the winding road toward the ranch house. Her hands began to shake as she dropped the pillowcase back into the laundry basket. Scout moved closer to her legs, pressing against her as if trying to shield her from whatever was coming. Maria's heart began to race as memories she had buried deep started clawing their way back to the surface. The sound of gravel under tires, the slam of car doors, the heavy footsteps on porch stairs. The voice that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years suddenly seemed to whisper in the Montana wind. She told herself she was being silly. It was probably just a neighbor or maybe someone who had gotten lost and needed directions, but her body knew better. Her hands were trembling now, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool October air. The dark SUV crested the final hill and came into full view. Maria's knees nearly buckled as she recognized the vehicle. It was the same black Suburban that had been parked in her driveway in Arizona 3 years ago. The same vehicle she had seen in her rearview mirror the night she finally found the courage to run. Scout began to growl low in his throat, a sound Maria had never heard from the gentle old dog. The vehicle slowed as it approached the ranch house, and Maria could see 2 figures inside. Her vision began to tunnel as panic set in, but she forced herself to focus. She needed to see their faces to be sure. The SUV came to a stop in the circular driveway in front of the main house. The engine turned off and the sudden silence was deafening. Maria held her breath as the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Even from a distance, even after 3 years, she recognized him immediately. The same swagger. The same way of scanning his surroundings like he owned everything he saw. The same cruel mouth that had whispered terrible things in her ear during the worst nights of her marriage. Her husband had found her. The passenger door opened and another man emerged. Taller, broader, with the kind of build that came from hours in a gym rather than hours of honest work. Maria didn't recognize him, but something about the way he moved, the way he positioned himself next to her husband, made it clear he wasn't here as a friend. Scout's growl grew louder, and Maria realized she needed to move. She couldn't let them see her standing here like a deer frozen in headlights. She needed to get inside the house. She needed to warn Betty. She needed to find Frank. But her legs wouldn't move. 3 years of peace and safety had made her forget how terror could paralyze a person, how fear could turn your body into stone and your mind into chaos. The 2 men began walking toward the front porch of the main house, and Maria finally found her voice. "Betty," she called out, but her voice was barely a whisper. She tried again, louder this time. "Betty?" The back door of the house opened, and Betty appeared with flour on her apron and concern in her eyes. "Maria, what's wrong, dear?" "There are men," Maria managed to say, pointing toward the front of the house. "Bad men. My husband." Betty's expression changed instantly. The kind, grandmotherly woman disappeared, replaced by someone fierce and protective. "Get inside," she said firmly. Now. Maria's legs finally obeyed, and she stumbled toward the house with Scout close behind her. As she reached, the sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch made Maria's blood turn to ice. She sat frozen in the kitchen chair while Betty moved around her with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with crisis before. The older woman pulled the curtains, closed and double-checked the locks on the back door. "Frank will be here in 5 minutes," Betty said, her voice calm but determined. "Until then, we stay put and we stay quiet." Scout had positioned himself directly in front of Maria, his gray muzzle pointing toward the front of the house. The old dog's protective instincts were fully awakened now, and he seemed to understand that his family was in danger. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by loud knocking. Maria jerked at the sound, her hands gripping the edges of the kitchen chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Mrs. Thompson," the voice called through the front door, and Maria's worst fears were confirmed. That voice had controlled her life for 5 years. It had whispered sweet promises during their courtship, shouted angry accusations during their marriage, and threatened terrible consequences the night she finally escaped. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, smooth and reasonable. "I just want to talk to my wife. Her name is Lisa, but she might be calling herself something else now." Betty's eyes flashed with anger. She had suspected that Maria wasn't her real name, but she had never pressed for details. Now, hearing this man claim ownership over the woman she had come to love like a daughter made her furious. "We're not answering that door," Betty whispered firmly. "Not until Frank gets here." Through the kitchen window, Maria could see movement in the yard. The second man, the one she didn't recognize, was walking around the property like he was surveying it. He moved with the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, and the way he checked corners and exits made it clear he had done this kind of thing before. "Lisa." Her husband's voice grew louder. "I know you can hear me. I've been looking for you for 3 years. Do you have any idea what you put me through? I was worried sick." The lies came so easily from his mouth that for just a moment, Maria almost believed them. He had always been good at making her feel guilty, making her think that his anger was somehow her fault. But then she remembered the bruises, the broken bones, the nights spent hiding in closets while he raged through their house looking for her. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he continued, his voice taking on that fake, reasonable tone she remembered so well. "I just want to bring my wife home where she belongs. We can work things out like civilized people." Betty moved to the kitchen window and carefully lifted one corner of the curtain. The man who wasn't Maria's husband was now examining the barn, the garage apartment, and the various outbuildings. He was clearly looking for escape routes or places someone might hide. "Who's that with him?" Betty whispered. "I don't know," Maria replied, her voice barely audible. "I've never seen him before." "Well, he's not here as a friend," Betty observed, grimly. The knocking on the front door became more insistent, and Maria could hear her husband's facade beginning to crack. His voice was getting harder, more demanding. "I know you're in there, Lisa. I saw you hanging laundry in the backyard. You always did like hanging laundry." The comment was casual, but there was menace underneath it. He was letting her know he had been watching her. Maria's stomach churned as she realized he might have been observing the ranch for hours or even days before approaching. He could know her routines, know when Frank and Betty left for town, know all the details of the life she had built here. The sound of a truck engine roaring up the driveway brought relief flooding through Maria's body. Frank was coming, driving faster than she had ever seen him drive before. Through the front window, she could see the dust cloud his truck was kicking up as he raced toward the house. Frank's truck skidded to a stop next to the black SUV, and Maria watched as her protector stepped out. Even at 55, Frank Thompson was an imposing figure. Years of ranch work had kept him strong and lean, and right now, every line of his body radiated controlled anger. Maria's husband and his companion had moved away from the front door when they heard the truck approaching. They now stood in the front yard, trying to look casual and non-threatening, but Maria could see the way her husband's body tensed when Frank appeared. He hadn't expected to deal with another man. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Frank's voice carried clearly through the windows. His tone was polite but cold. the kind of politeness that was more threatening than outright hostility. "We're looking for my wife," Maria's husband replied, immediately taking charge of the conversation. "Her name is Lisa, and we have reason to believe she's been staying here." Frank took a step closer, and Maria could see him assessing the two strangers. His eyes moved from her husband to the other man, clearly noting the way they positioned themselves, the expensive clothes that didn't belong on a working ranch, the soft hands that had never done hard labor. "I don't know anyone named Lisa," Frank said evenly. "She might be using a different name," the husband continued. "Brown hair, about this tall, very pretty. She's been missing for 3 years, and I'm worried about her mental health. She can be unstable sometimes." Maria felt sick hearing him twist the truth like that. He was already laying the groundwork to make her sound crazy, to make it seem like she couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. It was the same manipulation he had used during their marriage to isolate her from friends and family. Frank's expression didn't change, but Maria could see his hands curl into fists at his sides. "Like I said, I don't know anyone named Lisa. This is private property and you're trespassing." The second man, who had been quietly observing from near the barn, now walked closer. He was younger than Maria's husband, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of muscled build that came from steroids rather than honest work. "Look, old man," the younger man said, his voice carrying a clear threat. "We're not here to cause trouble, but we're not leaving without the woman. We know she's here." Frank turned his attention to the newcomer, and Maria could see something change in his posture. The polite rancher was gone, replaced by someone much more dangerous. "Old man," Frank repeated quietly. "Son, I was fighting in Vietnam before you were born. I've dealt with better men than you who thought they could come onto my land and make demands." Betty squeezed Maria's shoulder reassuringly, but Maria could feel the situation spiraling out of control. She knew her husband's temper, knew how quickly he could turn violent when he didn't get his way. And this other man, this stranger, seemed like the kind of person who solved problems with force. "We don't want any trouble," her husband said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "But I have legal rights here. Lisa is my wife. I have the marriage certificate to prove it." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Even from the kitchen window, Maria could see it was official looking, with seals and signatures. "See?" her husband continued, holding up the document. "Legal marriage. That woman in your house belongs to me, and I'm taking her home where she belongs." Frank took the paper and examined it briefly before handing it back. "Marriage certificate doesn't give you the right to take someone who doesn't want to go," he said calmly. "And it sure doesn't give you the right to come onto my property making threats." "We're not making threats," the younger man said with a cold smile. "We're just explaining the situation. Sometimes people need help understanding what's best for them." The menace in his voice was unmistakable now, and Maria realized this wasn't just about her husband wanting her back. There was something else going on, something that involved dangerous people and serious consequences. From inside the house, Maria's voice cracked as she called out desperately, "Please don't let them take me." Her husband's head snapped toward. The sound of her voice and his expression changed completely. The fake charm disappeared, replaced by the cold anger that had terrorized her for years. "There she is," he said, his voice taking on a possessive edge. "Lisa, baby, it's time to come home. You've had your little adventure, but enough is enough." Frank positioned himself squarely between the two men and the house. Despite being outnumbered and facing men who were clearly accustomed to violence, he didn't back down an inch. "The lady doesn't want to go with you," Frank said firmly. "In Montana, that means she stays put." "This isn't Montana business," the younger man replied, his hand moving inside his jacket in a gesture that made Frank's eyes narrow. "This is family business, and sometimes family business requires outside assistance." The threat was clear now. These men weren't just here to convince Maria to return willingly. They were prepared to use whatever force was necessary, and they had come equipped for violence. Betty had called 911, but they all knew it would be at least 20 minutes before the sheriff could reach the remote ranch. 20 minutes was a long time when dangerous men were making threats in your front yard. Maria's husband took a step toward the house, and Frank moved to block his path. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Frank warned. Old man, you have no idea who you're dealing with, her husband replied. I have friends who don't like it when people interfere in their business arrangements. The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Frank's declaration wasn't spoken in anger or bravado. It was stated as a simple fact, the way a man might comment on the weather or the price of cattle. This quiet certainty made it infinitely more terrifying than any shouted threat could have been. Maria's husband took an involuntary step backward. He was accustomed to intimidating people, but there was something about the weathered rancher that made his usual tactics feel suddenly inadequate. Frank Thompson stood like a mountain that had decided to defend itself, immovable, ancient, and absolutely deadly when threatened. You're making a big mistake, the husband said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. You don't understand the situation here. I understand it just fine, Frank replied calmly. A woman ran away from you 3 years ago because you hurt her. Now you've come to my land to take her back against her will seems pretty clear to me. The younger man, who had been growing more agitated by the minute, decided to take control of the situation. Listen, Grandpa, we tried to be nice about this, but you're starting to get on my nerves. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a pistol, holding it casually at his side rather than pointing it directly at Frank. The message was clear without being explicitly threatening. Yet, Frank's expression didn't change, but Maria could see his body shift almost imperceptibly. His weight moved to the balls of his feet. His hands relaxed at his sides in a way that would allow for quick movement. She realized with a chill that Frank had seen weapons before, had faced armed men before, and wasn't intimidated by the display. Put that away, Rico, Maria's husband snapped at his companion. We don't need that kind of trouble. Rico. Maria filed the name away in her memory, though she doubted she would ever forget this moment regardless. The gun disappeared back inside Rico's jacket, but his message had been delivered. These men were prepared to escalate the situation as far as necessary. Look, her husband continued, trying to regain control of the conversation. I don't want anyone to get hurt, but Lisa has something that belongs to me, and I need it back. Something that belongs to me. Not someone. Something. The words revealed more about his mindset than anything else he could have said. Maria wasn't a person to him. She was property that had been stolen. From inside the house, Betty appeared at the front window. She was holding Frank's old hunting rifle, not pointing it at anyone but making sure it was clearly visible. The elderly woman had positioned herself where she could cover the front yard, while staying protected behind the heavy wooden window frame. Rico noticed the rifle immediately and nudged Maria's husband. We've got problems, he muttered. Frank caught the exchange and allowed himself a small, grim smile. My wife Betty was county shooting champion 3 years running, he said conversationally. Still practices every Sunday after church. The dynamic in the front yard had shifted dramatically. What had started as 2 men intimidating an isolated rancher had become a potential crossfire situation with armed defenders who clearly knew how to use their weapons. Maria's husband was getting desperate. He could feel control of the situation slipping away, and desperation was making him reckless. Lisa, he shouted toward the house. You need to think about what you're doing here. You're putting these nice people in danger. Is that what you want? Do you want their blood on your hands? It was psychological manipulation at its most cruel. He was trying to make Maria feel responsible for the violence he was threatening to bring down on the people who had protected her. Inside the house, Maria felt the familiar weight of guilt that her husband had always been so skilled at creating. For just a moment, she considered walking outside, surrendering herself to save Frank and Betty from whatever consequences her presence might bring them. But then she remembered the faint scars on her wrists, the nights she had spent sleeping on the bathroom floor because it was the only room with a lock, the way her hands used to shake every time she heard his key in the front door. She remembered the last night, when he had wrapped his hands around her throat and she had seen her own death in his eyes. I'm not going with you, Maria called out, her voice stronger than it had been in years. Not ever. Her husband's facade cracked completely. The charming manipulator disappeared, replaced by the violent man she remembered all too well. "You stupid girl," he snarled. "Do you have any idea what you cost me when you ran away? Do you know what I had to promise people to get them to help me find you?" Rico grabbed his arm, trying to shut him up, but the damage was done. Frank's eyes narrowed as he processed this new information. "Cost you?" Frank repeated. "What did finding your wife cost you?" Maria's husband realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late to take the words back. "Nothing," he said quickly. "I just meant the time and effort." "No," Frank interrupted. "You said she cost you something when she ran away, and you had to promise people something to get them to help find her." What kind of people and what kind of promises? The pieces were falling into place now. This wasn't just about a controlling husband wanting his wife back. Maria had somehow become involved in something much more dangerous, whether she knew it or not. Rico was getting increasingly agitated. "We're running out of time here," he muttered to Maria's husband. "The boss isn't going to be happy if we come back empty-handed." The boss. Frank filed that information away as well. These men were working for someone else, someone who had a financial interest in getting Maria back. "What did you do?" Frank asked quietly, but his voice carried absolute authority. "What did you get that girl mixed up in?" "Nothing," Maria's husband said quickly. "It's not what you think." "I think you borrowed money from dangerous people," Frank continued relentlessly. "I think you used your wife as collateral somehow, and when she disappeared, you became responsible for a debt you couldn't pay." The guilty look that flashed across her husband's face confirmed Frank's suspicions. "That's what this is about," Frank continued, his voice filled with disgust. "You sold your wife to cover your gambling debts, and now you need her back to keep yourself alive." Rico's hand moved toward his jacket again. "We've heard enough. Old man, you and your wife need to go inside and mind your own business. We'll take the woman and be gone in 5 minutes." "Over my dead body," Frank replied simply. "That can be arranged," Rico said with a cold smile. The standoff had reached its breaking point. 3 years of peace and safety hung in the balance as two very different worlds collided in a Montana ranch yard. On one side stood people who believed in protecting the innocent and standing up for what was right. On the other side stood people who viewed human beings as commodities to be bought, sold, and traded. In the house, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She stood up from her chair, ignoring Betty's protests, and walked to the front. "Torser." Scout immediately moved to her side, his old body trembling with the effort to protect his person. "Maria, no," Betty whispered urgently. But Maria had heard enough. She had listened to her husband reveal his true motives, had watched Rico threaten the people who had given her a new life, had seen Frank prepare to die rather than let her be taken. She unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. "I'm here," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Now everybody can stop pretending this is about love or marriage or family. This is about money, isn't it? About debts and threats and dangerous people." Her husband's face went pale. He hadn't expected her to figure out the real situation. "Lisa, baby, you don't understand." "My name is Maria," she interrupted firmly. "Lisa died 3 years ago in Arizona, and I understand perfectly. You gambled away money you didn't have, borrowed from people you shouldn't have borrowed from, and when they came to collect, you offered them me instead." Rico was grinning now, seeing the conversation as confirmation that they were leaving with their prize. "Smart girl. Saves us all a lot of trouble." But Frank stepped between Maria and the two men. "She's not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Frank," Maria said softly, "you don't understand what these people are capable of. If I don't go with them, they'll hurt you and Betty. They'll burn down your ranch. They'll destroy everything you've built here." "Then they'll have to kill me first," Frank repeated, and this time his hand moved to his belt where Maria could see the handle of a knife he carried for ranch work. The situation was spiraling toward violence, and everyone in the yard could feel it. Rico's hand was inside his jacket now, and Betty's rifle was visible in the window. Frank was positioned like a man preparing for battle, and Maria stood on the porch like someone preparing for sacrifice. In the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to echo across the Montana landscape. Sheriff Patricia Hernandez was still 10 minutes away, but the sound gave everyone pause. "Time to go," Rico said urgently. "Not without her," Maria's husband replied. "The cops are coming," Rico insisted. "We need to cut our losses. The boss said not to come back without her. The boss also said not to get arrested." Frank listened to this exchange with growing understanding. These men were caught between their mission and their survival instincts. Desperate men trapped between their own failures and their employer's expectations were the most dangerous kind of all. Time seemed to slow down as Rico raised his weapon. The black metal gleamed in the afternoon sun, and Maria could see Frank calculating distances, angles, and possibilities. Betty's rifle remained steady in the window, trained on the younger man who was now the most immediate threat. "Put the gun down, son," Frank said calmly. "You don't want to do this." "Actually, I really do," Rico replied with a cold smile. "I'm tired of listening to you people act like you have a choice in this matter." But something unexpected happened. Maria's husband, the man who had controlled her through fear and violence for 5 years, suddenly grabbed Rico's wrist and forced the gun down. "Are you insane?" he hissed. "That's a sheriff's siren. If you start shooting now, we'll have every cop in Montana looking for us." Rico yanked his arm free but kept the gun lowered. "Then what's your brilliant plan? Stand here and have a tea party until they arrest us?" The sirens were getting closer, maybe 5 minutes away now. Frank could see the two men beginning to panic, which made them infinitely more dangerous. Desperate criminals made bad decisions, and bad decisions got people killed. "There's still time to leave," Frank offered. "Get in your vehicle and drive. Away. No one gets hurt. No one goes to jail." "We can't leave without her," Maria's husband said, but his voice lacked conviction now. The approaching sirens were making him reconsider his priorities. "Why?" Maria called out from the porch, surprising everyone. "Why can't you leave without me? What exactly did you promise these people?" Her husband looked at her with a mixture of desperation and hatred. "You really want to know? Fine. I owed Vincent Carrera $50,000. When you disappeared, he decided that you were worth that much to him. Now I owe him a woman instead of money." The words hit Maria like a physical blow. Vincent Carrera was a name she recognized from news reports, a loan shark and human trafficker who operated out of Phoenix. Her husband hadn't just used her as collateral for a debt. He had essentially sold her to one of the most dangerous criminals in the Southwest. Frank's jaw tightened as he processed this information. "Human trafficking," he said quietly. "You sold your wife to human traffickers." "I didn't sell her," her husband protested weakly. "It was just a business arrangement." "You're disgusting," Betty's voice called out from the window, filled with more contempt than Maria had ever heard from the gentlewoman. Rico was getting more agitated by the minute. The sirens were close enough now that he could probably see dust clouds from the approaching vehicles if he looked down the valley. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Grab the woman and let's go." He started toward the porch, but Frank stepped into his path. Despite being 20 years older, the rancher moved with surprising speed and strength. Before Rico could react, Frank had grabbed his wrist and twisted, forcing him to drop the gun. The weapon clattered across the wooden porch steps, and Scout, despite his age, immediately pounced on it and began dragging it away from the confrontation. The old border collie might not be able to fight anymore, but he understood enough to remove weapons from the equation. Rico swore and lunged for the gun, but Frank caught him around the waist and threw him backward into the dirt. The younger man was strong from hours in the gym, but Frank had the kind of functional strength that came from decades of wrestling cattle and hauling hay bales. "You just assaulted me," Rico screamed, scrambling to his feet. "That's assault." "I saw a trespasser lose his footing," Frank replied calmly, echoing the words Maria had heard him use to deflect blame in situations before. "Happens a lot on ranches. Dangerous places for city folk." Maria's husband was backing toward his SUV now, clearly ready to abandon Rico if necessary. But Rico wasn't finished. He pulled a knife from his boot, a wicked-looking blade that caught the sunlight like a threat, made manifest. "Nobody touches me," he snarled, advancing on Frank with the knife held low and professional. Frank's expression changed. The calm rancher disappeared, replaced by someone much more dangerous. Maria suddenly remembered Betty mentioning that Frank had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and she was seeing that soldier emerge now. "Betty," Frank called out without taking his eyes off Rico. "If he gets past me, shoot him." "Already planning on it," came the steady reply from the window. Rico hesitated, realizing he was caught between an armed woman with a clear shot and a man who showed no fear whatsoever of an armed confrontation. The sound of vehicles racing up. The dirt road was clearly audible now. Sheriff Patricia Hernandez was less than 2 minutes away, bringing backup and the full authority of Montana law enforcement. "It's over," Frank said quietly. "Put the knife down, and maybe you walk away from this." "We don't walk away," Rico replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Vincent doesn't accept failure." "Then you should have thought of that before you came to my ranch making threats," Frank said. Maria's husband had reached his SUV and was frantically trying to start the engine. But in his panic, he had flooded it, and the vehicle refused to turn over. He was trapped in the front yard with his partner, facing armed resistance and imminent arrest. "Rico," he called out, "forget the woman. We need to go now." But Rico was beyond listening to reason. The combination of fear, anger, and whatever substances he might have been using had pushed him past the point of rational decision-making. He feinted left and then lunged right, trying to get around Frank and reach Maria on the porch. Frank moved like a man half his age, intercepting Rico's charge and grabbing his knife hand. The 2 men went down in a tangle of arms and legs, rolling in the dirt as they struggled for control of the weapon. Betty's rifle cracked once, the sound echoing across the valley like thunder. She hadn't shot either of the men. Instead, she had put a round into the engine block of the black SUV, ensuring that even if her husband lost his fight, the intruders wouldn't be driving away. The engine hissed and steamed, and Maria's husband stared at Betty with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. The elderly woman had just demonstrated that she was prepared to use lethal force if necessary, and her shooting skills were every bit as good as Frank had claimed. Frank and Rico were still wrestling for the knife when the cavalry finally arrived. 3 police vehicles roared into the front yard, followed by an ambulance and what looked like half the volunteer fire department. Sheriff Hernandez emerged from the lead car with her weapon drawn, quickly assessing the situation. "Sheriff's Department," she called out. "Everyone freeze." Frank immediately released Rico and raised his hands, but Rico made one last desperate attempt to complete his mission. He scrambled to his feet and lunged toward the porch where Maria stood. He made it exactly 3 steps before Betty's second shot took him down. The rifle bullet caught Rico in the thigh, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the dirt. He wasn't seriously injured, but he was effectively neutralized. The knife flew from his hand and landed in a flower bed 20 feet away. "That was a warning shot," Betty called out from the window, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "The next one won't be." Sheriff Hernandez and her deputies quickly took control of the situation. Rico was cuffed and loaded into an ambulance, more as a precaution than from any serious injury. Maria's husband was arrested and stuffed into the back of a patrol car, his dreams of easy money finally coming to an end. The sheriff, a competent woman in her 40s who had dealt with domestic violence cases for most of her career, took statements from everyone involved. Maria told her story for the first time in 3 years, revealing not just the abuse she had suffered, but the criminal conspiracy that had brought these men to Montana. "Vincent Carrera," Sheriff Hernandez repeated when Maria mentioned the name. "We know that name. He's been on our radar for human trafficking operations. This gives us a direct connection to him." Frank was examined by paramedics but refused treatment for the minor cuts and bruises he had sustained in the fight. Betty was praised by everyone for her marksmanship and her restraint. She could easily have killed Rico, but had chosen to wound him instead. As the sun began to set over the Montana ranch, the last of the police vehicles finally drove away. Rico was in the hospital under guard, facing charges for assault with a deadly weapon and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Maria's husband was in jail, looking at charges for human trafficking, conspiracy, and a dozen other felonies that would keep him away from society for a very long time. But the most important thing was that Maria was safe. She stood in the front yard of the ranch that had become her home, watching the dust settle from the day's events. Scout sat beside her, the old dog somehow having understood his role in disarming Rico and looking quite proud of himself. Frank walked up beside her, moving a little stiffly from the fight but otherwise unharmed. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Maria nodded, but tears were streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm so sorry I brought this to your home. You and Betty could have been killed because of me." Frank put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Maria, you didn't bring this here. Evil men brought this here. You're just the person they were trying to hurt. But if I had never come to Montana—" "If you had never come to Montana," Frank interrupted, "Betty and I would never have had a daughter, and that would have been our loss." Maria looked up at him, surprised by his words. 6 months later, the Montana spring had transformed the ranch into something that looked like a postcard. The rolling hills were covered in new grass, wildflowers bloomed along the fence lines, and the cattle were healthy and fat from the mild winter. But the biggest change wasn't in the landscape. It was in the young woman who now carried the legal name, Maria Thompson. The adoption had been finalized in February, with Judge Patricia Martinez presiding over a ceremony that was equal parts legal proceeding and family celebration. Frank had worn his only suit, the same one he had been married in 30 years earlier. Betty had worn her best dress and cried through the entire ceremony. Maria had worn white, not as a symbol of purity, but as a symbol of new beginnings. The local newspaper had covered the story, though they had been careful to protect Maria's privacy and location. The headline read, "Montana Ranchers Adopt Adult Daughter in Heartwarming Ceremony," and the article focused on the legal precedent and the family's commitment to helping domestic violence survivors. What it didn't mention was that the adoption had also provided Maria with legal protection from any future attempts by her biological family to claim her. The criminal case against her former husband had moved through the courts with surprising speed. Vincent Carrera, the loan shark and human trafficker, had been arrested in a multi-state operation that used her ex-husband's testimony to build cases against dozens of criminals. Her former husband had received a 15-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation, and Rico had gotten 12 years for his part in the conspiracy. More importantly for Maria's peace of mind, Vincent Carrera had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The debt that had made her a target no longer existed, and the man who had considered her property was never going to hurt anyone again. But the legal victories, while important, were less significant than the personal growth Maria had experienced. The frightened woman who had fled Arizona 3.5 years earlier had been replaced by someone confident, strong, and surrounded by people who loved her. Frank had taught her to drive the big ranch truck, and she now handled supply runs to town with the confidence of someone who belonged. Betty had taught her to bake bread from scratch, tend the vegetable garden, and manage the ranch's financial books. She had learned to ride horses, repair fences, and even help with calving season when the pregnant cows needed extra attention. Scout, the old border collie, had lived to see Maria's legal adoption but passed away peacefully in his sleep just 2 weeks later. Frank said the dog had held on long enough to make sure Maria was truly safe, and then let himself rest. They buried Scout under the oak tree where he used to nap, with a headstone that read, "Scout Thompson, faithful friend and protector." The ranch had acquired a new dog, a young German Shepherd mix named Dakota, that Maria had rescued from the animal shelter in town. Unlike Scout, who had been gentle and protective, Dakota was energetic and playful, reflecting the change in Maria's own personality. She could laugh freely now, run through the fields without looking over her shoulder, and sleep through the night without nightmares. The garage apartment had been expanded and renovated into a proper home for Maria, with a full kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley. But most evenings she still ate dinner with Frank and Betty in the main house because that's what families do. The ranch itself had prospered during the months following the confrontation. Word had somehow spread through the ranching community about Frank's stand against the criminals, and neighbors who had always respected the Thompsons now held them in something approaching awe. Other ranchers began asking Frank's advice on everything from cattle breeding to conflict resolution, and Betty found herself counseling women who were trying to escape abusive situations. They had quietly become part of an informal network that helped domestic violence survivors disappear and start new lives. Maria's story had inspired other people to offer safe havens, and the Thompson Ranch had become a way station for women traveling to new lives in other states. The most recent guest had been a young mother named Jennifer, who had arrived with 2 small children and nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes. Maria had helped her understand the legal process of changing identities, while Betty had provided practical support like childcare and emotional guidance. Frank had given Jennifer's ex-husband a phone call that convinced him not to pursue his missing family too aggressively. Jennifer and her children were now safely settled in Oregon, where she worked as a bookkeeper for a small business, and her kids attended school under new names. She sent postcards occasionally, signed only with a smiley face, but Maria knew she was thriving. On this particular spring morning, Maria was working in the vegetable garden behind the main house, planting tomatoes and peppers in neat rows that would feed the family through the summer. Dakota was helping by digging holes in completely the wrong places and chasing butterflies that had no interest in being caught. Frank emerged from the barn, moving a little more slowly than he used to, but still strong and capable. The confrontation, 6 months earlier, had taken something out of him, though he would never admit it. The stress of potentially losing Maria, combined with the physical demands of fighting a man half his age, had reminded him that he wasn't invincible. "Garden's looking good," he commented, stopping to examine Maria's work. "Betty says we'll have enough tomatoes to supply half the county," Maria replied, wiping dirt from her hands on her jeans. "Your grandmother always did plant too much of everything," Frank said with a smile. It still felt strange sometimes calling Betty and Frank her grandparents, but it was getting more natural every day. "Speaking of Betty," Maria said, "she wants to know if you're ready for lunch." "In a minute," Frank replied. "I wanted to talk to you about something first." Maria felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the old fear that someone was about to deliver bad news. But Frank's expression was thoughtful rather than worried. "What is it?" she asked. "Betty and I have been talking," Frank began, "and we think it's time you considered going back to school." "School?" Maria repeated, surprised by the suggestion. "College," Frank clarified. "You're 28 years old and you're smart as a whip. You could study anything you wanted. Business, agriculture, social work, whatever interests you." The idea had never occurred to Maria. Her formal education had ended when she graduated high school and immediately married her abuser. The thought of sitting in classrooms with people 10 years younger seemed impossible. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "I've been out of school for so long." "So have lots of people," Frank replied. "Montana State has programs for adult students. You could start part-time, take a few classes and see how it goes." "What would I study?" Maria asked, warming to the idea despite her reservations. "That's up to you," Frank said. "But if I had to guess, I'd say you might be interested in helping other people who've been through what you've been through." The suggestion resonated with Maria immediately. She thought about Jennifer and her children, about the other women who had passed through the ranch seeking safety and new beginnings. She thought about how difficult it had been to navigate the legal system, the social services, and the practical challenges of building a new identity. "Social work?" she asked. "Could be," Frank replied. "Or psychology, or criminal justice, or law. Lots of ways to help people who need it." Maria looked out over the ranch that had become her sanctuary, the place where she had learned to be safe and happy and loved. The idea of leaving it, even temporarily, felt frightening, but the idea of using her experiences to help others felt like a calling. "I'll think about it," she promised. "That's all we ask," Frank said. "Betty's already researched the programs and the financial aid options. Turns out there are scholarships specifically for domestic violence survivors who want to go back to school." Betty's voice called from the kitchen window, reminding them that lunch was getting cold. Frank and Maria walked toward the house together, with Dakota bounding ahead of them and disappearing through the dog door Betty had installed in the mudroom. As they reached the porch steps, Maria paused and looked back over the ranch one more time. The place that had saved her life was still beautiful, still peaceful, still home. But maybe, she thought, it was time to consider how she might save someone else's life. "Frank," she said quietly, "thank you. For everything. For saving me, for adopting me, for believing I could be more than just a victim." Frank paused on the steps and looked at his adopted daughter, this brave young woman who had survived horrors that would have broken many people. "Maria," he said, "you were never just a victim. You were always a survivor. Betty and I just helped. You remember that?" Inside the house, Betty had prepared a feast of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from their own garden, and fresh rolls that were still warm from the oven. It was too much food for 3 people, but Betty had never learned to cook for a small family. Over lunch, they talked about the ranch, the weather, the new calf that had been born the previous week, and Maria's potential return to school. They talked about ordinary things in the comfortable way that families do, without drama or tension or fear.